Chosen one, there are moments in life when nothing looks wrong on the surface, yet something inside you feels watched, measured, quietly opposed. Not in a dramatic or paranoid way, but in the subtle sense that your growth, your peace, your progress seem to disturb something unseen. You begin to notice patterns. Plans fall apart right before they succeed. Opportunities appear, then disappear without explanation. Conversations feel normal, but afterwards something feels off. Like information about you traveled further than it should have. You cannot prove anything, yet your intuition keeps whispering the same question: who is quietly watching your life unfold, not to support you, but to study you? Hidden enemies rarely announce themselves. They do not confront you directly because their power comes from observation, not opposition. They are patient. They watch your habits, your reactions, your vulnerabilities. They learn when you are strongest and when you are most tired. They notice what excites you, what discourages you, and what makes usable. Enemies attack loudly and openly. Hidden ones gather understanding first. They study your rhythm, and once someone understands your rhythm, they don't need to block your path. They only need to disturb your timing. You may have felt this before without realizing what it was. You share a dream with someone, and suddenly your motivation fades. You begin something meaningful, and unexpected distractions multiply. You move in silence for weeks, making progress, but the moment others notice, resistance appears. It is as if attention itself becomes a weight pressing against your movement. That feeling is not always coincidence. Sometimes attention changes energy, observation changes dynamics, and when someone observes you with insecurity, jealousy, competition, or silent resentment, their awareness alone can influence the environment around you. Hidden enemies are not always dramatic figures lurking in shadows. Sometimes they are ordinary people with unspoken emotions, a person who smiles but feels threatened by your growth. Someone who listens carefully, not to understand you but to measure themselves against you. Someone who appears supportive but quietly hopes you slow down, stumble, or remain where they feel comfortable seeing you. Their conflict is not always with you personally, often it is with what you represent. Your courage reminds them of their fear, your progress highlights their stagnation, your discipline exposes their excuses, and instead of confronting themselves, they watch you, waiting for proof that you are not as strong, capable, or steady as you appear. Observation is powerful because it collects data. Think about how carefully researchers observe patterns before making conclusions. Hidden enemies behave the same way. They notice how you respond to praise. Do you relax? They notice how you react to criticism. Do you overthink? They notice what drains you: conflict, uncertainty, loneliness, pressure. They don't interfere constantly. They simply wait for moments when your own emotional state becomes your weakest defense. When you are overwhelmed, they don't need to push you. They only need to stay silent and let your exhaustion do the work. This is why hidden opposition often feels invisible yet strangely effective. Nothing obvious happens, yet progress slows. Confidence weakens without clear cause. You begin doubting decisions you once felt sure about. You second-guess yourself more than before. You feel mentally crowded, like too many eyes are on your life, even when no one is physically present. That sensation can come from subtle psychological pressure, the awareness that someone is measuring you, comparing themselves to you, or quietly waiting for your misstep. But the most important thing to understand is this: hidden enemies are rarely powerful on their own. Their influence depends almost entirely on your awareness and emotional response. If you move carelessly, revealing every plan, reacting to every comment, explaining every decision, you give observers material to analyze. The more predictable you become, the easier you are to anticipate. And anticipation is the hidden enemy's greatest advantage. When they know how you respond, they don't need to act directly. They can simply place subtle pressure where they know you will feel it most. Many people unknowingly make themselves easier to observe by seeking validation too early. They announce goals before building strength. They reveal ideas before protecting them. They share struggles with people who listen with curiosity but not loyalty. Each time you expose something unfinished, something fragile, something still forming, you allow others to watch the process, and observation shapes outcomes. Some people do not need to sabotage you physically. Their doubt, their silent judgment, their skeptical attention can influence your own mind. And once your mind becomes uncertain, the work slows naturally. Another sign of hidden observation is emotional mirroring. Have you ever noticed how your mood shifts after interacting with certain people, even when nothing negative was said? You leave feeling drained, restless. That is not always imagination. Humans constantly exchange emotional signals, tone, posture, subtle expressions. Someone who watches you with comparison or resentment may never speak a negative word, yet their presence communicates tension. Over time, repeated exposure to that tension can affect your clarity, confidence, and focus. But here is something most people never realize: being watched is not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is evidence of significance. No one studies what feels irrelevant. No one tracks what seems unimportant. Hidden attention often follows visible movement. When you grow, evolve, change direction, or pursue something meaningful, you naturally attract observers. Some watch with admiration, some watch with curiosity, and some watch with silent discomfort. The presence of watchers does not mean you are in danger, but it does mean your movement matters enough to be noticed. The real risk appears when awareness turns into reaction. If you begin shaping your behavior around who might be watching, you lose freedom. If you shrink your goals to avoid attention, you limit your potential. If you constantly defend, explain, or justify yourself, you drain energy that should be used for growth. Hidden enemies gain influence only when you become preoccupied with them. Their greatest success is not stopping you, it is making you watch them watching you. So the question is not who is watching. The deeper question is, how do you move when you know observation exists? Strength is not found in confrontation, but in composure. Silence becomes protection. Consistency becomes unpredictability's opposite, steady progress that does not depend on approval or reaction. When your actions come from clarity instead of emotional response, observation loses power. People can watch, but they cannot steer. There is also wisdom in selective visibility. Not everything you build needs an audience while it is forming. Seeds grow underground before anyone sees the plant. Muscles strengthen in repetition before results appear. Ideas mature in quiet thinking before they become reality. Privacy is not secrecy born of fear. It is protection born of understanding. What is still fragile deserves space. What is still forming deserves time. When you learn to protect beginnings, observers only see outcomes, not vulnerabilities. And something remarkable happens when hidden enemies can no longer predict you. They lose interest. Observation without influence becomes exhausting. When your emotional state remains steady, when your plans unfold quietly, when your reactions no longer provide information, watchers receive no data to interpret. They cannot anticipate what they cannot measure. And eventually, attention shifts elsewhere, not because they stopped watching intentionally, but because there is nothing useful to learn. Perhaps the most empowering realization of all is this: hidden enemies cannot define your direction unless you unknowingly cooperate with them. They cannot slow your progress unless you internalize their silent expectations. They cannot shape your identity unless you begin performing for their invisible audience. Awareness protects you not by making you suspicious of everyone, but by making you intentional with yourself. So if you feel watched, do not panic. Do not shrink, do not obsess over identifying every hidden observer. Instead, refine your movement, strengthen your focus, protect what is still growing. Let your progress become quieter, deeper, more grounded. Let your confidence come from alignment, not recognition. Because the most unsettling thing for anyone who watches you with doubt is seeing you continue forward with calm, steady certainty, unaffected, unbothered, and impossible to predict. And that is where true power begins, not in exposing hidden enemies, but in becoming someone whose direction cannot be quietly redirected by unseen eyes. What makes hidden enemies truly dangerous is not their presence. It is their patience. Open conflict has noise, tension, visible lines. You know where you stand, and so does everyone else. But hidden opposition moves quietly through time. It does not rush. It does not reveal emotion. It simply waits for natural human moments: fatigue, distraction, overconfidence, emotional vulnerability. And because these moments are part of ordinary life, their interference feels almost indistinguishable from coincidence. This is how silent pressure operates. Nothing dramatic happens. Instead, small disruptions appear at meaningful times. A delay when timing matters most, a misunderstanding when clarity is essential, a subtle shift in trust when stability is needed. Each event taken alone seems harmless, but over time patterns form, momentum slows, focus scatters, confidence weakens, and because the disruption is never loud enough to confront directly, it becomes difficult to defend against consciously. Hidden enemies understand something deeply psychological. People rarely guard themselves against what feels subtle. Humans prepare for obvious threats. They brace against criticism, defend against confrontation, protect against visible competition. But they do not protect themselves against gradual emotional erosion. They do not defend their attention. They do not shield their focus. They do not monitor how repeated exposure to quiet tension shapes their thinking. This is why hidden opposition often works through environment rather than direct action. It influences atmosphere. It creates subtle discomfort around your movement. Imagine trying to walk confidently through a room where you feel silently judged. No one says anything. No one stops you. Yet your body stiffens, your thoughts tighten, your natural rhythm changes. That shift alone can alter performance. Not because someone attacked you, but because awareness of observation changes behavior. Over time, this kind of pressure can create self-surveillance. You begin watching yourself the way you believe others are watching you. You monitor how you speak, how you act, how quickly you progress. You start adjusting your natural pace to avoid drawing attention. Without realizing it, you become both the performer and the audience inside your own life. And once that happens, hidden enemies no longer need to observe you. You have internalized the observation for them. This internalization is their most effective victory. Because once you begin limiting yourself preemptively, their work becomes unnecessary. You hesitate before sharing ideas. You question whether your success will make others uncomfortable. You reduce your visibility, not from wisdom, but from fear of being seen too clearly. Your own caution becomes the barrier they could never build externally. But here is something that changes everything. Awareness can reverse this entire process. The moment you recognize how subtle pressure operates, you regain control over your responses. You begin noticing when hesitation is natural caution versus when it is inherited tension. You start distinguishing between genuine intuition and emotional residue left by others' silent expectations. And this clarity creates space. Space between stimulus and reaction, space between observation and influence. When that space exists, something powerful happens. You begin choosing your reactions deliberately. You stop absorbing emotional signals automatically. You stop interpreting every delay as a sign of opposition. You stop shrinking simply because attention exists. Instead, you observe the environment with the same calm awareness that others may be using to observe you. This is the shift from being watched to being aware. Awareness does not mean suspicion. It means presence. It means understanding that not everyone who observes you wishes you well, but also not everyone who watches you intends harm. Most importantly, it means recognizing that observation itself is neutral. It only becomes powerful when it shapes your internal state. There is a quiet strength that develops when you become emotionally non-reactive to being observed. You stop rushing to prove yourself. You stop over-explaining decisions. You stop defending choices that do not require defense. You move with grounded certainty, not because no one is watching, but because their watching does not determine your direction. And when this shift happens, hidden enemies face a problem they cannot easily solve. Unpredictability without chaos. You remain steady, but not transparent. Consistent, but not easily mapped. Focused, but not revealing your internal process. They see movement, but cannot identify the mechanism behind it. They witness progress, but cannot trace the steps that produced it. This creates informational silence. Informational silence is one of the strongest forms of personal protection. It is not secrecy born from fear, it is strategic restraint born from clarity. You share results, not vulnerabilities. You express values, not insecurities. You communicate direction, not every stage of the journey. And when information becomes selective, observation becomes less useful. Think about how difficult it is to predict a person who does not react impulsively, someone who pauses before responding, someone who processes privately, someone whose emotional state remains stable across changing circumstances. Their consistency does not provide clues, it provides calm, and calm offers nothing for hidden opposition to manipulate. But emotional steadiness requires inner discipline. It requires you to confront something uncomfortable, the human desire to be understood by everyone. Many people reveal too much too soon simply because they want recognition, validation, or connection. They assume transparency builds trust universally, but not every observer is a safe witness to your process. Some people do not need access to your unfinished thoughts. Some people do not need to see your moments of doubt. Some people are not equipped to hold your vision without filtering it through their own limitations. And when you reveal something sacred to someone who cannot respect its weight, their observation can distort it, not intentionally, but inevitably. So part of protecting yourself from hidden enemies is learning emotional boundaries that feel natural rather than defensive. You do not withdraw from the world. You simply become discerning about where your inner world is visible. You learn that privacy is not isolation, it is preservation. Another important truth is that hidden enemies are often sustained by comparison. They measure their worth against your movement. They monitor whether you are ahead, behind, or changing direction, and comparison feeds observation. But when your path becomes internally guided, shaped by personal alignment rather than external competition, comparison loses relevance. They cannot measure what is not moving on their scale. This is why purpose-driven individuals often seem difficult to destabilize. Their motivation does not depend on being seen, approved, or validated. Their direction is anchored internally. Observation becomes background noise rather than a controlling force. Hidden enemies can watch endlessly, yet nothing shifts, because the source of movement exists beyond their reach. Still, awareness must remain balanced. Seeing hidden opposition everywhere can create unnecessary tension. The goal is not hypervigilance. The goal is clarity. You acknowledge that some people observe with resistance, but you do not build your identity around their existence. You recognize subtle pressure, but you do not become defined by defending against it. Instead, you cultivate a quiet ground naturally resists manipulation. You rest deeply. You think carefully. You act intentionally. Your decisions arise from alignment, not reaction, and slowly, something remarkable unfolds. Observation stops feeling threatening. It becomes irrelevant, because when your direction is stable, your pace intentional, and your emotional state self-regulated, hidden enemies lose their only leverage, influence through uncertainty. They can watch your path, but they cannot alter your footing. They can observe your movement, but they cannot interrupt your rhythm. They can measure your progress, but they cannot redirect your purpose. And eventually, the entire dynamic changes. You are no longer someone being silently studied for weakness. You become someone whose stillness cannot be disturbed, whose focus cannot be scattered, whose growth cannot be quietly contained. Hidden enemies do not disappear, but their presence becomes weightless. Observation continues, but influence ends. And you move forward with something far more powerful than secrecy, far more stable than defense, and far more enduring than reaction. You move forward with inner sovereignty, a state where no unseen eyes, no silent comparisons, no unspoken tensions can quietly rewrite the direction of your life. There comes a moment when awareness alone is no longer enough. You begin to understand that hidden enemies exist, that observation carries influence, that silence can hold intention, but understanding without transformation changes nothing. The real shift happens when you stop simply recognizing hidden pressure and begin strengthening the parts of yourself that cannot be quietly shaken. Because here is a truth most people overlook. Hidden enemies do not target your circumstances as much as they target your stability. They cannot always control what happens around you, but they hope to influence what happens within you. If your emotions swing easily, they wait for emotional storms. If your confidence depends on constant reassurance, they wait for silence. If your focus weakens under tension, they allow tension to build. Their strategy is not to overpower you, but to wait until you destabilize yourself. So the real protection against hidden enemies is not distance, confrontation, or exposure. It is inner structure. It is becoming someone whose emotional foundation remains steady even when external conditions fluctuate. A person whose direction does not collapse when attention increases. A person whose sense of self does not fragment when misunderstood, observed, or quietly opposed. This kind of strength is not loud. It is not aggressive. It is not defensive. It is deeply rooted composure. Think about what happens to something that is firmly rooted in the ground. Wind can move around it. Rain can strike it, shadows can fall across it, but its position remains unchanged because its stability comes from depth, not surface conditions. Hidden enemies operate mostly at the surface: attention, comparison, emotional signals, subtle pressure. But when your stability comes from depth, surface disturbance loses its power. Depth is built through self-trust. Self-trust is not arrogance. It is not believing you are always right. It is the quiet confidence that you can observe yourself honestly, correct yourself when needed, and remain aligned even when others misunderstand you. When self-trust is strong, you do not rely on external validation to confirm your worth or direction. And without that dependency, hidden observation loses one of its strongest tools, the ability to make you question yourself. Many people underestimate how much energy they spend unconsciously seeking reassurance from their environment. They look for signs that others approve of their progress. They scan for reactions to their decisions. They interpret silence as judgment, distance as rejection, curiosity as threat. This constant monitoring of external response creates emotional instability, and instability is exactly where hidden opposition thrives. But when you trust your internal compass, external signals become information rather than authority. Someone's opinion does not become your reality. Someone's silent observation does not become your self-image. You remain aware of others, but you are not shaped by their invisible expectations. Another layer of strength comes from emotional regulation. Hidden enemies often rely on emotional predictability. They expect that pressure will create frustration, that silence will create doubt, that attention will create anxiety. They assume that your emotional reactions will follow familiar patterns, and when reactions are predictable, influence becomes easy. But emotional regulation disrupts this pattern completely. When frustration arises and you respond with calm analysis instead of impulsive reaction, observers lose feedback. When uncertainty appears and you respond with patience instead of panic, pressure loses its leverage. When attention increases and you remain grounded instead of performative, observation loses its reward. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means processing emotion privately and responding intentionally. Your inner experience remains real, but your outward expression becomes deliberate, and deliberate expression reveals nothing that can be easily manipulated. Another powerful shift happens when you detach your progress from visibility. Many people measure their movement by how seen it is. If others notice, progress feels real. If others do not respond, progress feels uncertain. But this dependence on recognition creates vulnerability, because hidden enemies can do something very simple. They can withhold reaction. Silence alone can make visible progress feel invisible. But when progress becomes internally measured, visibility loses importance. You know what you are building, whether anyone else acknowledges it or not. You know how far you have come, whether others recognize the distance or not. Your sense of movement becomes self-confirmed, and self-confirmed growth cannot be quietly diminished by lack of response. There is also immense strength in strategic patience. Hidden enemies often rely on time pressure. They benefit when you feel rushed, when you act before thinking, when urgency overrides clarity, because rushed decisions reveal more information, create more mistakes, and generate more emotional reaction. Speed exposes structure, but patience protects structure. When you slow down intentionally, you see more clearly. You notice subtle patterns. You detect shifts in energy. You choose responses that align with long-term direction rather than short-term emotion. Patience does not make you passive, it makes you precise, and precision is difficult to disrupt. One of the most transformative realizations you can reach is this: not every battle deserves acknowledgement. Not every tension deserves attention. Not every silent resistance deserves interpretation. Hidden enemies often rely on mental occupation. They want space in your thoughts, because once they occupy your mind, they influence your focus, and focus determines movement. So sometimes the most powerful response is selective disregard. You notice the presence of subtle opposition, but you do not give it narrative. You do not build stories around it. You do not analyze it endlessly. You simply continue your direction with calm awareness. You neither deny nor obsess. You remain centered. Another form of strength emerges when you become comfortable with being misunderstood. Hidden enemies often exploit the fear of misinterpretation. They rely on the idea that you will explain yourself repeatedly to correct perceptions. They expect that confusion will pull you into constant clarification, and each explanation reveals more information, more emotion, more vulnerability. But when you accept that not everyone will understand your intentions, your timing, or your silence, you become free from the need to constantly manage perception. You allow misunderstanding to exist without rushing to erase it. And this removes a major channel of information that hidden observers often rely on, your attempts to correct their view of you. The strongest individuals are not those who are perfectly protected from observation. They are those who remain internally undisturbed by it. Their energy is not spent monitoring watchers. It is invested in building, refining, aligning, and moving forward. And something subtle yet powerful happens when you embody this level of inner stability. The dynamic reverses. Instead of feeling like someone being watched for weakness, you become someone whose composure itself becomes observed with uncertainty. Those who once studied you for patterns now find no predictable reaction. Those who once anticipated emotional shifts now find emotional consistency. Those who once measured your movement now find movement guided by something they cannot access. At this stage, hidden enemies face a silent barrier. Psychological distance, not physical distance, not social distance, but energetic distance. They can observe your presence, but not your process. They can see your actions, but not your internal mechanism. They can witness your progress, but cannot trace its source. And this is where personal power becomes undeniable. Not dramatic, not visible, but undeniable. Because real strength does not come from confronting hidden enemies. It comes from becoming someone who cannot be quietly shaped by them. You stop living reactively. You stop adjusting yourself to invisible pressures. You stop explaining your rhythm to silent observers. Instead, you move from alignment, steady, intentional, internally anchored. At that point, something shifts deep within your experience of life. The sensation of being watched no longer feels threatening. It becomes background noise, like distant movement that does not alter your path. Awareness remains, but tension dissolves. You are no longer navigating around unseen eyes. You are simply walking your direction with grounded certainty. And when that happens, the greatest protection is no longer something you actively maintain. It becomes who you are, a presence that cannot be easily unsettled, a focus that cannot be quietly redirected, a mind that cannot be subtly crowded by invisible pressure. Hidden enemies may still watch, but they are no longer watching someone fragile, uncertain, or easily influenced. They are watching someone whose inner world has become a place they cannot enter, cannot disturb, and cannot control. Eventually, you reach a stage where the entire idea of hidden enemies begins to lose its emotional weight. Not because they have disappeared, not because observation has stopped, and not because the world has suddenly become completely transparent, but because you have changed your relationship with influence itself. What once felt like pressure now feels like background movement. What once felt like tension now feels like information. What once made you cautious now makes you clear. This is the stage where awareness matures into mastery. At first, discovering that unseen opposition may exist can feel unsettling. It can make the world seem layered with hidden motives and silent intentions. But if you continue growing inwardly, something profound happens. Your attention shifts away from who might be watching and toward how you choose to live regardless of who is watching. That shift transforms everything, because the deepest truth is this: the presence of hidden enemies is never the defining factor of your life. Your internal alignment is. Alignment means your thoughts, emotions, and actions move in the same direction. There is no inner contradiction pulling you apart. You are not saying one thing while feeling another. You are not acting from fear while pretending to be confident. You are not seeking approval while telling yourself you are independent. Alignment creates coherence, and coherence creates strength that cannot be easily fractured from the outside. Hidden enemies depend on inner fragmentation. They rely on hesitation, self-doubt, emotional conflict, and internal noise. They benefit when your mind is divided, when your focus is scattered, when your direction is uncertain. But when alignment becomes your foundation, those entry points begin to close naturally. Influence has nowhere to attach because there are no loose emotional threads to pull. You begin to notice a quiet stillness forming within you, not the stillness of inactivity, but the stillness of stability. Your thoughts become less reactive. Your emotions move more smoothly. Your decisions feel less rushed. Even when challenges appear, your internal state does not collapse into urgency. You respond rather than react. You observe rather than absorb, and this inner stillness creates something powerful: energetic independence. Energetic independence means your state of being is self-generated rather than externally triggered. Praise does not inflate you. Criticism does not destabilize you. Silence does not make you question yourself. Attention does not make you perform. Observation does not make you shrink. Your emotional environment is created from within, not borrowed from the atmosphere around you. When this happens, hidden enemies lose their final channel of influence, emotional resonance. They can no longer create subtle shifts in your state because your state does not depend on them. Their attention becomes like wind moving past a mountain. It touches the surface, but it does not alter the structure. There is also a quiet confidence that emerges when you fully accept that you cannot control who watches you, what they think, or what silent expectations they carry. Many people unconsciously try to manage perception. They want to be seen correctly, understood accurately, interpreted fairly. But this desire creates endless vulnerability because perception is never fully controllable. When you release the need to control how others interpret you, a huge amount of mental energy becomes available again. You stop performing clarity for others. You stop correcting every misunderstanding. You stop shaping your expression to avoid silent judgment. Instead, you become simple, direct, and grounded in your own experience. This simplicity is not weakness. It is clarity without distortion, and clarity has a powerful effect on your presence. People who once tried to read hidden meaning into your actions find nothing to decode. People who once looked for emotional openings find steadiness instead. People who once expected reaction find composure. Over time, their attention loses intensity because it no longer produces insight. You become difficult to interpret, not because you are secretive, but because you are consistent. And consistency is one of the hardest things to manipulate. Another transformation happens in how you relate to progress. Earlier in life, progress may have felt like something that needed protection, something fragile that could be disrupted by attention, pressure, or silent opposition. But as your internal structure strengthens, progress becomes resilient. It no longer depends on ideal conditions. It continues through distraction, through observation, through uncertainty. You stop protecting growth with tension and start sustaining it with stability. Growth becomes like breathing, continuous, natural, not performed for anyone, not paused because someone is watching. And this changes how you experience effort. Effort becomes focused rather than defensive. You build because building is your nature, not because you are trying to outrun unseen resistance. At this level of development, even the concept of hidden enemies begins to transform. They are no longer figures of concern or suspicion. They become part of the environment, like shadows that exist because light exists. Observation becomes a neutral phenomenon, not a personal threat. And something surprising happens when you reach this emotional neutrality. Many hidden tensions dissolve on their own. Not because people suddenly change, but because your lack of reaction removes the dynamic that sustained the tension in the first place. Observation without emotional return loses energy. Silent comparison without visible impact loses purpose. Watching without influence becomes meaningless. Your calm becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects nothing back for others to engage with. And without engagement, subtle opposition fades into irrelevance. But perhaps the most important transformation of all is internal freedom. Internal freedom is the ability to move through life without carrying invisible weight from imagined scrutiny. It is the ability to act from intention rather than anticipation. It is the ability to think clearly without filtering every thought through who might be watching, or how might this be perceived, or will this create silent resistance. You begin living directly rather than defensively. Your energy flows into creation, learning, building, experiencing, connecting, not into guarding, monitoring, or interpreting. Life feels lighter not because observation has vanished, but because it no longer occupies your attention. And this is where your power becomes fully self-contained. Not hidden, not displayed, simply self-contained. Your strength exists whether acknowledged or not. Your direction remains steady whether supported or not. Your peace remains intact whether understood or not. At this stage, even if hidden enemies exist, their role in your life becomes minimal. They may watch, but they do not shape. They may observe, but they do not influence. They may exist, but they do not define. You have moved beyond defense into self-possession. Self-possession is the quiet state of owning your mind, your emotions, your direction, and your pace completely. Nothing external dictates your internal rhythm. Nothing unseen redirects your intention. Nothing silent unsettles your center. And when you live from self-possession, something subtle but profound radiates from you, an atmosphere of unshakable presence. Not intimidating, not aggressive, but deeply grounded. People sense it even if they cannot explain it. It is the feeling of someone who cannot be quietly moved. This presence does not fight hidden enemies. It makes them irrelevant, because ultimately, the greatest protection you can ever develop is not awareness of who watches you, but mastery of what within you can be moved by watching. When nothing within you is easily disturbed, influenced, or redirected, observation loses its power completely. And that is where your journey leads, not toward exposing every hidden enemy, not toward eliminating silent opposition, but toward becoming internally sovereign. A person whose peace is self-sustained, a person whose direction is self-chosen, a person whose growth is self-driven, a person whose inner world remains untouched by unseen pressure. Hidden enemies may exist in the world around you, but they no longer exist in the space that determines who you are becoming. And that is the final shift, when the unseen loses authority and your life moves forward from a place no silent observer can ever reach.